HowToAnalysts.com is going to teach you everything you need to know about pivot tables, so let's get started right now. How do you make a pivot table? The first step is you need some data to pivot. Here we have website data that we're going to be pivoting. The second step is you need to highlight the data that you're going to pivot. Before you try to make a pivot table, it's important to note, does each column in your pivot table have a name? Does each column have a header? Because if you're missing a header, the pivot table is going to give you fits, it's not going to work right, and you're going to wonder what went wrong. Well, your column didn't have a header. So always make sure your columns have a header before you make a pivot table. To make a pivot table, go to the Insert tab, click Pivot Table. Excel prompts you with some options. The first is select a table or range. We already did that. Looks good. The next thing is, where do you want the pivot table to be placed? We want the pivot table in a new worksheet. So looks good. We're going to click OK. Here's the table, and it hasn't been populated yet. That's the next step. These fields should look familiar. Quarter, date, month, session duration, page views. If we go back to the source data, each field is a column name. You build a pivot table by dragging these fields into the areas below. For example, we're going to bring month year to rows. We're going to bring site to columns. And then we're going to bring page views to values. We dragged month year to rows, and it appeared in our rows. These are our month years. We dragged site to columns, and we see that in our columns, site A and site B. We dragged page views to values, and we see the page views in this area. A pivot table summarizes the underlying data that you're pivoting on. As you saw, the data that we're pivoting on is hundreds of rows long, but the pivot table allows you to summarize that in a really small chart. That's the value of the pivot table. We can continue to add fields to our table to learn how it works. Let's drag quarter to rows. The way I like to describe this is that quarter is the parent, and then month year is the child. So you've got a parent-child relationship here, and it's very easy to see the way that it's formatted. In fact, you can collapse the parent if you don't want to see the child by clicking on this button. So if you want to see a condensed view without month year, you can just collapse by clicking on these plus minus buttons. We can drag one more. We can drag session duration into values. got a little confusing there. Clean it up. But really, we just added session duration next to page views. So here's site A and its sum of page views and its session duration. And here's site B and its page views and its session duration. The pivot table allows you to manipulate your data really easy. For example, we want to see page views next to each other so we can easily compare. To do that, we drag site below values. So now you have page views for site A and site B right next to each other. It makes for an easy comparison. Same with session duration for site A and site B. And if you want them in a different order, you drag one below the other. Same with the rows. Now that looks a little funky because you've got months on top, but the concept is the same. You've got columns, you've got rows, you've got values. There's filtering as well. So this is the way I like to filter is click on the field that you want to filter on. So here we only want to look at site B. So I click on site B, right click, filter, keep only selected items. That's the way I like to filter, especially as data gets larger. It's the most intuitive way for me. When you click that, only site B appears because we wanted to keep only site B. The way you know you're filtered on site is there's a filter emoticon next to site. In addition to right clicking and keeping, we'll go back. You can drag site into the filters section and do your filtering there. So what we did was we took site from columns, dragged it into filters. It tells you we're filtering on all sites right now. Well, let's just look at site A. That's another way you can filter, but I prefer the right click technique. It's just more intuitive and makes more sense to me. Another really powerful way you can filter is using a mechanism called a slicer. Now, the biggest advantage of the slicer is when you're dealing with multiple pivot tables. So to show you how a slicer works, we're going to take this pivot table, copy it, paste it here. So you have two identical pivot tables. We're going to filter this one on site B. Two identical pivot tables, but we want to filter them on the same quarter. We want to do it in one click. We want one mechanism to control both of these pivot tables, and that's what a slicer is. To insert a slicer, go up to the Analyze tab and click Insert Slicer. We want a slicer on quarter. Click OK. Here's our slicer. We want to make sure it's connected to both this pivot table and this pivot table. To do that, right-click on your slicer, go to Report Connections. it has a check mark next to pivot table 1. We also want to check it has a check mark next to pivot table 2, but we also want to check pivot table 1. This means that the slicer will control both of these pivot tables. Click OK. Now that the slicer is connected to both pivot tables, we can click on which quarter we want to see, and it will affect both equally. This is powerful, especially as you deal with multiple pivot tables, 2, 3, 4, and you want to make sure each one is looking at the same time period or the same region, or one characteristic needs to be the same across each pivot table. We're now going to review formulas and how the formulas work in pivot tables. When we dragged session duration and page views into the values section, it defaulted to a sum. That means it's summing session durations for the month of August, and it's summing page views for the month of August. Excel recognizes whether or not the field is a numerical field. It will sum numerical fields, as it's doing here. However, if we were to drag site into the values, it's going to count site. Site is a text-based field that just says site A or site B, so it's going to default to count. My experience is the count isn't very helpful, and that the greatest advantage comes with the numerical values. Excel defaults to sum of the value field, but it also has a lot of other functions. If you double click on the value, it takes you to the value field settings. These are the options that you have available for that value. You can sum it, you can count it, you can average it, find the maximum number, the minimum number, the product. And these are all really helpful. In this instance, we have sum of the session durations. We know how long the session durations were for the entire month, but I want to find the average. What was the daily average? That's a more helpful number. Well, the average for Q3 was 319 seconds, 152 seconds in August, and 426 seconds in September. Same can be done with page views. There's another way to get there. You can click on this arrow in the values section and go to value field settings. Average. So the average page views were 9. So in August, there was an average of 9 page views a day at 152 seconds. That's an overview of the values pane and what you can do with the values pane. In addition to dragging fields into the values section, you can also create formulas within the pivot table. For example, we know that average session duration is 152 seconds and an average page view of 9 seconds. Well, let's find out the average session duration per page view. How many seconds is the user on each page? To do that, we go up to the Analyze section fields, items, and sets. And this is what you call a calculated field. We're going to insert a calculated field and call it page view duration. To calculate page view duration, we are going to sum session duration. To bring that up, just double click it and divide that by the sum of page views. Add. And when you added that, the calculated field shows up in your pivot table fields right here. So you're essentially adding a new field. Click OK. Here's our new field, page view duration. What it's doing is taking the average session duration, dividing it by the average number of page views. My experience with calculated fields is that they're too complicated and they're not worth their while. What I like to do is build my formula on the side, and I'll show you what I mean. We're going to filter, hide site B, get rid of page view duration, and we want to hide these totals too. As I said, calculated fields personally are too much work. I like to just build it right here. Call this page view duration. Drag it down, and then you can copy this and paste formats. It looks like it's part of the pivot table, but it's not, and it was much easier to compute than the calculated field. Let's look at the layout of the pivot table and the different ways that we can arrange the layout. To get to the layout section, go to Design, and then in the lower left corner there's the Layout section. And there's some really helpful things that you can find in here. The first helpful one is the grand totals. As you can see here, we're calculating these formulas for site A and site B, but what if we wanted to see them for both sites? To do that, go to grand totals, turn them on for rows, and the total average session duration populates, and the total average page views populates. Similarly, you can do this for columns, and you'll get the total average session duration and the total average page views across both quarters. And finally, you can just put them on for all. In addition, this is a grand total. It's summing Q3 and Q4. There's also a subtotal, which is the Q3 and Q4 calculation, which is summing August and September and October through December respectively. So you can turn that off using the subtotals. do not show subtotals. So now Q3 is blank and Q4 is blank. We're not showing the subtotals by quarter. You can also adjust where you want to see the subtotals. Do you want to see them at the bottom, below the months, or do you want to see them at the top? Top is less rows, and I like that. We'll keep it at the top. Moving on to the report layout section of the layout area, note that quarter and month are both in column A. They're just condensed beneath. The months are just the months are just condensed beneath the quarters. Sometimes you're going to want to change that, and to do that, you can go to the report layout, show in tabular form. What changed? Well, now quarter is in column A and month is in column B. There's a time and a place for both. For example, if you want to do formulas on month year and you don't want it underneath quarter, you can put it into tabular form. In addition, on the report layout section, you can repeat all item labels. Now this will save you some time. If you look, the quarter isn't populating on each row. You can tell by the formatting that it's assumed that September is part of Q3, and it's assumed that December and November are part of Q4. Sometimes you're going to want quarter next to each month. Report layout, repeat all item labels. Now quarter is populated next to each month. The last thing we're going to talk about is formatting. And there's a reason why formatting is the last thing we're going to talk about, because it's a black hole and it can be a major time suck. If you're formatting at the beginning, your analysis is going to take much longer. Always wait until the end to format, once all the data is set, because the most important part is that the information's right. Once you've ensured that the information's right and you have it in the right layout, then start formatting it. The first thing I like to do is get rid of the way Excel populates the values. When you drag fields into the values section, Excel tells you what it's doing: average of session duration, average of page views. This is sloppy, and if you're going to present it, you want to get rid of that. So in this instance, you could say average session duration. And to do that, you just double click on the value, you go into custom name. Another alternative is maybe you don't even want average, and you've got a bunch of different values that you want to change quickly. Click on each value, home, select and find, replace. A shorter way is Control H. So you want to find average of, and you want to replace it with nothing. Replace all. It's a quick and easy way to format it the way that you want. In addition to what we've covered, there are a lot of ways to format your pivot table in the Analyze Options section. Now, a lot of this is redundant. A lot of the options that you have in here can be done on other tabs, specifically the Layout tab that we reviewed. The one thing that I like to do is uncheck Autofit column widths on update. I'll show you what this does. We have our columns the widths that we want. This is the way we want it. When we refresh by right-clicking and pressing refresh, the pivot table changes the column widths. This can be really frustrating, so let's get rid of that. We're going back to where we were and unclicking this. Now, once you get your column widths where you want them, the refresh will not change them at all. Let's do a test. Let's do a big old test. Test, test, test. Let's keep testing all night long.